Thanks for joining me, David and Eryk.
Good to be talking again.
Great to be with you, Rachel.
Eryk, Anthony Albanese will be arriving in Beijing tomorrow. It's been 6 years since an Australian Prime Minister has travelled to China. So just how big a deal is this visit?
Well, a lot's changed in 6 years. The Australia-China relationship just a year or two ago had never been in a worse position. In the space of, let's say 18 months or so, the Albanese government has managed to probably get it back to a more stable footing, but it is not going to return to the same place that it was when Tony Abbott last visited Beijing. Those were the heady days of $200 billion plus in trade, a warm relationship, one that even at one stage included a potential extradition agreement between Australia and China, a piece of legislation that is now unthinkable. Since then, we've seen foreign interference legislation, we've seen trade strikes, calls for a COVID-19 inquiry, and the detention of multiple Australians in China. So the relationship has changed dramatically. And as far as we can tell, this trip is really about getting the two sides talking again in a way that respects each other's interests.
And this visit has been much speculated about, David. There have been whispers and talks of an official leader's visit to China for some time. Why is it happening now?
The timing is quite deliberate in the sense that there have been quite a few global summits that have been held. Through the course of this year, Anthony Albanese has spoken to the President of China, Xi Jinping, at events like the G20 summit earlier, and that cleared the way for a face-to-face meeting in China. But also I think that Australia managed the optics of this very carefully because, as we know, Anthony Albanese is only just back from a visit to the White House. He makes a point often that he's had 9 meetings with President Joe Biden. The most recent of those meetings included the welcome on the South Lawn of the White House, the meeting in the Oval Office, meeting with cabinet ministers, and lunch at the State Department, as well as a state dinner at the White House. So the optics are pretty deliberate. Australia has confirmed its alliance with the United States, made some forward movement on the AUKUS submarine pact. At the same time, it's prepared for this visit to Beijing. And it's only after those visits those discussions with Joe Biden that Anthony Albanese is now having this meeting really at the heart of Chinese power in Beijing.
As you just said, David, this China trip comes off the back of a very recent trip to the US, and the Prime Minister told US officials he was clear-eyed about the threat posed by China. So I'm keen to get your thoughts, both of you, on how that will affect the upcoming meetings.
I think it sets the scene for the meetings pretty well because it's clear that it's in Australia's interest to have a stabilisation in the relationship with China. It's also in America's interest to know that relations with China are improving, not deteriorating. There are lots of sources of friction, but we know that Joe Biden is going to be meeting Xi Jinping in San Francisco on the sidelines of the APEC summit, and that's only around November 12, right? So that's not that far away. So I think it's good to see this visit by the Australian leader in the context of broader global efforts, really, to stabilise relations with China, to remove sources of friction. And that's been something that the Australian government's been doing over the last 18 months, especially on the trade front. We read a lot about the removing trade barriers. When Anthony Albanese came to office, he visited Tokyo, met Joe Biden and the leaders of Japan and India, and one of his first comments was that he would go to Beijing at some point. He was happy to have a meeting with Xi Jinping, but he wanted trade sanctions removed. And so really that's been one of the conditions from the Australian side in any effort to have a meeting. And generally there's been some success there. There's been the removal or the promise of removal of trade sanctions or restrictions of some kind on wine. Things have improved on the exports of other Australian goods, ranging from barley to other agricultural products. I think there are still concerns about some restrictions on things like lobsters. But on the whole, the situation has greatly improved. However, there's still clear friction. It was only, a week or so ago that Chinese vessels were basically intimidating Philippine vessels trying to resupply an outpost on one of those contested reefs in the South China Sea. So that, you could call it aggression really from China towards its neighbours in that region is still a source of concern. It's a source of concern for Joe Biden. It's a source of concern for Anthony Albanese. Those issues are still on the agenda, even though there is this positive movement on trade.
Just on the timing of the visit and the background in the US, as Anthony Albanese was leaving Washington, they were preparing to welcome Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, to a meeting with Anthony Blinken. So these great powers, and they are the great powers in the world, are not only talking to each other, but almost working and negotiating around each other. They know it's in their interest to talk. Australia, even though Albanese is reluctant to say that Australia is somehow a negotiator or a facilitator in that relationship, you can bet that both the Chinese side in Beijing and the American side in Washington will be passing messages to the Prime Minister to relay them to the other side. And that can run the gamut of national security, the South China Sea, Taiwan, issues about arbitrary detention. All those factors are there. I think the optics of this trip are going to be very interesting because we saw the full guard of honor, the military band, the drums playing at the White House, all the spectacle of a US state visit. We are not going to see Anthony Albanese walking along the PLA military line outside Tiananmen Square. I think the officials there have organised for a meeting to take place indoors in the Great Hall of the People. We're told it's November, it's going to be cold. But the potential pushback on the optics of Albanese walking along a Chinese military line, as many other world leaders have done in Beijing in recent times, would have been really challenging for Canberra. And I think they've managed to avoid that in this particular visit.
One of the things we don't know yet is how the Chinese side will use the optics of the meeting. It will be in the Great Hall of the People, a very big space. There was a visit there by Tony Abbott in 2014 at a very positive time in relations between Australia and China. Tony Abbott met Xi Jinping in the Great Hall of the People. They basically closed a deal on trade that became the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, later followed by trade sanctions. So the value of that trade agreement has always been subject to question. But it was a very positive time. But the optics there included, I remember, quite a few military personnel inside the Great Hall of the People. And the Chinese side does know how to make a point with that. My memory of that meeting in the Great Hall of the People was that as the meeting ended, all the journalists were gathered on one side of the hall to watch at a distance the leaders. And at some kind of signal from one of the military officers, the entire military guard did a full 180 and suddenly were fully facing all the media who were assembled in the hall. So they really know how to send a message, whether it's to the media or to the leaders in Beijing.
Foreign Minister Penny Wong is also going to China, and she said earlier this week that she would take any opportunity to make representations on behalf of Chinese-Australian writer Dr. Yang Hengjun. He's been detained in China for more than 4 years. Eryk, what do you think could happen there?
Well, the Australian government has been making representations to the Chinese government for a long time on Yang Hengjun. He's been there for really almost 5 years now. We saw a really powerful letter from his sons written to the Prime Minister just yesterday. The honest truth is they haven't really made any inroads. There was a tactical decision made about a year or so or more ago to split the cases of Cheng Lei and Yang Hengjun. They advocated publicly for Cheng Lei, and then when they talked about Yang Hengjun, they made sure they did it as a separate case. That's because the reality is his case is more complicated. He has publicly been very critical of the Chinese government in a way that Cheng Lei has not. He has been a pro-democracy activist. He also has a past working for the Ministry of State Security in China many decades ago. They recognise it as a much more challenging case. And so negotiating him out of there on what are, by all accounts, spurious national security charges has been really challenging. I think of all the Australians, and a reminder, there are about 60 Australians or so detained in China, most of them on drugs charges. Yang Hengjun is the most likely to next be released. But he's also, for that reason, a really powerful diplomatic pawn for China. I mean, this is arbitrary detention. They've used it very successfully in the past against places like Canada and Japan, for that matter. They don't let someone go lightly, and as we've seen in the Australian case, the Australian government might well argue that it does not operate with China on a transactional basis, but there is no way that Beijing is letting Australian citizens go and not expecting anything in return.
David, you're going on this trip to China. Besides making a case for Dr. Yang, is there anything Australia wants to get out of this trip? What do you expect to see?
I expect to see a lot of ceremony, and I expect to see a lot of caution from the Australian side on specific things that they would be seeking from Beijing, or even specific things that Beijing would be seeking from us. And I think that's a very wise approach from the Australian government, because I think very early on, as soon as the idea of a visit to Beijing was aired, I think Anthony Albanese was careful not to get himself into a situation where he was locking in a visit and surrounding it with expectations that he must get an outcome of some kind. For instance, if he'd done this visit or had raised the idea of this visit 6 months ago or a year ago, there would have been heightened expectations that he would have had to have returned from Beijing with some concessions on trade. That's not the case here, because a lot of those trade obstacles have been overcome sort of with quiet diplomacy over the last year. The worst thing, I think, for Anthony Albanese would be to go to Beijing with an expectation that he must return with an outcome, because that's exactly the scenario that gives Beijing leverage over him.
I think that's really interesting, tactically speaking, as well, because what they did is string out the possibility of the visit. So when I was in Japan with him for the G7, we'd repeatedly ask, will you be going to Beijing? The answer was always, yes, I intend to visit Beijing. And the purpose there was to make sure that Australian negotiators could continue to be in the room when they were negotiating with their Chinese counterparts about things like Chunglei, about wine, about barley. The promise of the visit gave the negotiators an excuse to talk to their Chinese counterparts. And it was not until that excuse, which allows China to also save face in its negotiations, but it was not until Chunglei was released and not until the major trade sanctions were reviewed that the actual visit was announced. So there's been some very clever diplomatic manoeuvring here by the Australian government.
And so that also means that I think it really is an opportunity for Australia to put its position directly to the Chinese leadership with concerns about the South China Sea, with concerns about regional security, and about how we see China's place in the world when it's clearly a rising power that wants to wield more influence among its neighbours and in its region, but also, as you can see with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is also a key partner of Russia, and that's a source of concern around the world. So some of these geopolitical issues are the things that the leaders really need to discuss, much more so, I think, than specific trade barriers on one or two products.
So it sounds like, in the whole, a largely symbolic meeting of the two countries. But what about China, Eryk? There have been pressing, for example, for membership of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. Why does China want in, and are they likely to use these meetings to make their case?
Absolutely. The CPTPP, which is perhaps the most unwieldy acronym in world trade, is China's ultimate goal. It sees that Trans-Pacific Partnership as its crowning achievement as a large trading nation. It would bring down substantial tariffs right across the board, across a dozen member countries right around the Pacific Rim. China and America, actually, are the only two members of those Pacific countries that are really not members. Trump pulled America out while he was in office. So China wants in on the CPTPP. It has told every one of its partners, its rivals, places like Japan and South Korea, that it wants in. Australia was the major thing standing in the way of its ascension because it was the most obvious and public example of trade strikes. We had lobsters sitting on tarmacs, we had coal sitting on ships, wine barrels, essentially blocked for 3 years from arriving in China. It was such a visceral and obvious trade embargo situation because of disputes over human rights and national security that no member of the Trans-Pacific Partnership could in good conscience admit China into such an agreement. And now, one by one, those trade sanctions have been lifted. And somewhat surprisingly, perhaps, the language Australia is using around the Trans-Pacific Partnership and China's potential admission has softened. Only slightly, and it is very subtle, but it has gone from being no prospect of China ever joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership to a sort of somewhere between no comment to the possibility of Australia not opposing China joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was reported by the South China Morning Post last week. So I think there's a nuance there. It's definitely China's absolute goal. If Australia does not oppose China's entrance into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, well, that would be a remarkable turnaround. And I think it would probably show just how transactional some of these relationships can be.
In a sense, there's got to be a position from Australia that holds out the promise of a further improvement in relations on trade with China if it abides by what Western leaders often call the rules of the road. If China was to take a less aggressive approach in the South China Sea, it would be, according due respect to the international law of the sea, which it currently does not in that region. And on trade, if it was to desist with the trade barriers that it keeps imposing or has imposed on Australia and others, then there would be more confidence about it joining, the international, joining other countries on trade. It sought membership of the World Trade Organization many years ago, and yet many of its actions are not in the spirit of membership of the World Trade Organization. So there's basic skepticism about its application to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Even if Australia was to say, look, we're not going to object to your membership of the TPP is a matter for consensus among the dozen or so members of the TPP, Japan being most important, Vietnam also being a member, New Zealand also a member. It's pretty clear that Japan doesn't want China to be in the TPP. So Australia is not the only decision there. Even if we were to say we don't object, we would expect Japan to object. And I think because of the strength of the Australian relationship with Japan, especially the Quad Alliance, Australia would be saying, look, if Japan objects to China's membership, that's fairly definitive from the Australian point of view. So that's the reality of it. But there does need to be this pathway, I think, for a normalisation and a stabilisation in trade relations with China. And there has to be a recognition that at some point, if it is willing to abide by what Western leaders call the rules of the road, then it would qualify for membership at some long-term date in the future, I think.
There is a bit of a curveball, and that is perhaps a compromise position, which is not necessarily opposing or supporting China's membership of the TPP. It's whether Australia supports Taiwan's membership of the TPP, which had been moving and gathering some momentum over the past year and is now, I think, completely off the radar at the moment because of this renewed engagement with China. Obviously, if Taiwan's application to join the TPP was accepted, that would seriously anger Beijing. But I do wonder whether there's a path there that kind of almost appeases China by not engaging with Taiwan's bid to join that giant trade bloc.
Well, it's going to be very interesting to see the reporting from both of you over this trip. Thanks so much for your time, Eryk.
Great to be with you, Rachel.
See you in Shanghai, Eryk.
See you, mate.
And Rachel, just as Eryk logs off, it occurs to me that one of the really interesting backstories about this whole visit is that Eryk is even allowed to be in Shanghai because, of course, we haven't had a correspondent in mainland China because of security concerns. So around this prime ministerial visit, not only is Eryk able to travel into mainland China, but but I'm also able to go in as part of the broader media group that's travelling with the Prime Minister. And this is something that would have been considered routine a decade ago, but is now actually quite challenging to arrange. And that's a sign of the way in which China has changed. Our security concerns about being inside China are much greater than they used to be. The fact that we're all warned against taking our normal phones and laptops into China is a sign of the way China has changed. So this visit behind the scenes has involved quite a lot of logistical challenges that are almost a story in themselves.
Absolutely. David, I want to turn to talk about Israel and how the situation there is playing out politically here. Earlier this week, 6 former Australian prime ministers issued a joint letter condemning Hamas and expressing their support for Israel and Jewish Australians. Can you tell me a bit about the letter? Who was behind it, and why do you think they decided to come out with it now?
Well, a big motivating force behind the letter was the fact that there are a lot of demonstrators on the streets in Australia showing support for the Palestinian people who are, many are on the West Bank, but many are in the Gaza Strip and in Gaza City, suffering from either actual attacks or the threat of imminent ground invasion by Israeli forces. And so with those demonstrators speaking up for the Palestinian people, I think there was a sense that somebody needed to make the point about the problems on both sides of this dispute, and in particular, emphasise the initial attack by Hamas on innocent people in Israel that really has been seen by the people of Israel as an act of war. And Josh Frydenberg, former Treasurer, was a key player in getting the letter written. Malcolm Turnbull was also heavily involved in getting the letter written. And that's where we see 6 former prime ministers agreeing on a joint statement that emphasised, the incredible pain for innocent people in Israel, but also had that note about the civilian deaths, the deaths of innocent people on the Palestinian side as well. And so it was quite a measured response. It is interesting that Paul Keating, former PM, didn't sign up to it. I didn't see that he had a particular problem with specific wording in the letter. I think Malcolm Turnbull arranged to smooth over some of the differences between the former leaders to make sure that the letter reflected a consensus position. And that's not a common thing, not an easy thing to achieve. And it's not common in Australian life where 6 former PMs make a statement like that. But that's basically the story behind that statement. And it highlights, I think, the emphasis on the moral outrage at the initial attack by Hamas terrorists.
I also want to ask you about Australia's recent decision to abstain from voting at the UN General Assembly on a humanitarian truce. That's the first step to a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. That resolution was passed with 120 countries in support, 14 countries against, and 45 abstaining. So why do you think Australia wouldn't have supported that motion? And what do you think it can tell us about the Albanese government's thinking right now?
Well, the government's position is to try and, show a sense of balance between these terrible conflicting forces in the Middle East. But the basic problem from the Australian point of view with that resolution was the lack of any forceful condemnation of Hamas for the initial attack on innocent civilians in Israel. And without that element, it wasn't a statement that the Australian side could support, because right from the beginning, Anthony Albanese and the government, and Penny Wong as Foreign Minister, have been very clear in their condemnation of the terrorist attack by Hamas that really triggered what we're now seeing. And for all the arguments about the scale and the proportionality of the response from the Israeli side, any statement from the Australian point of view has to begin with a condemnation of what Hamas did in the first place. This is a very difficult kind of line for the government to walk because of the ferocity of the arguments on either side of the dispute. But it is fairly essential to the Australian response here, even though it's difficult day by day to get the tone right in the debate.
Well, as you just said, the tone is really important in this debate, and it seems to be very complex, especially for the government internally, given the variety of viewpoints within the party room. How tough is that job?
Incredibly difficult, because we've seen situations where clearly Anthony Albanese is condemning the loss of any innocent civilian life. Every innocent civilian life matters, is what he says. He said that at his press conference with Joe Biden at the White House just the other day. So it's a very consistent message from Anthony Albanese. But he's got members of the caucus who would see things more from the point of view of the Israeli Defense Force and the Israeli people. But he's also got members of the caucus who are speaking up for the innocent lives lost on the Palestinian side. And of course, we saw that with Ed Husic, Western Sydney MP, who made that point very clearly. Anne Ali, the Western Australian MP with an Egyptian heritage, she made that point very strongly as well. But we're also seeing it from MPs who aren't particularly invested in the issue through personal heritage, but they represent communities in Western Sydney that feel very strongly about the horror about what's happening to Palestinian people who are currently stuck in Gaza, cannot get out of Gaza, are being told to move to areas of Gaza where they may be safe, but cannot find any area of Gaza where they may be safe. So that terrible situation has been sort of given voice by Labor ministers like Tony Burke, which then leads to an attack on whether it's Tony Burke or Ed Husic or others for sounding like they are too sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, when, let's face it, what they're sympathetic to is the plight of innocent people who are on the Palestinian side of this conflict but are bearing the brunt of civilian casualties. And I think it's important to note that those Labor ministers who are, I guess, sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinian people here, they're still not making any bones about the fact that they're condemning Hamas, and they're condemning the way in which Hamas uses civilians as a human shield in this conflict.
Well, David, thanks as always for your excellent analysis. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Rachel.